Hello and welcome. My name is Philip Totaro. I'm the founder and CEO of Intel Store, and I'm here to give you an overview of the global wind energy operations and maintenance market. Over the past 10 years, we've collected data on 386,000 globally installed and under construction wind turbines and compiled that information to look at trends in the market. What you're seeing here are the trends in cost escalation for both standard maintenance and full wrap agreements, which include standard maintenance plus warranty on some of the major components. And the numbers represent, in the different timeframes, represent the cost variance for contracts that have been signed for projects that went COD in that year. The good news, in spite of the fact that there's more than 12% increase from 2010 through 2020, is that that curve is leveling off a little bit, and things on an absolute basis per turbine are getting a little bit less expensive. Certainly on a normalized basis, because wind turbines are getting bigger, the cost distribution is better. But you can see that the cost of a standard maintenance contract is now almost as, on the high end of the curve, is almost as expensive as the low end of a full wrap agreement back in 2010. And currently, for projects that are going COD in 2020, a full wrap maintenance contract from a wind turbine OEM could be as expensive as $50,000 to $55,000 potentially per wind turbine. With that in mind, just to share a few of the assumptions that were made with this, these numbers that you're looking at are now just the capacity weighted average. And we wanted to look at costs on a currency adjusted basis and an inflation adjusted basis, so that those adjustments have been made in these numbers. And we've also assumed that these costs are for year 10, taking into account an average annual escalator between 2.5% and 3%. Although we all know that there's usually a step change after year 5 or year 10 on a long-term contract. If you average that over the course of a 10, 15, 20, 25-year OPEX contract, it averages out to about 2.5% to 3% annual growth. So with those cost escalations in mind, and keep in mind this is all pre-COVID-19, we'll get to what the impacts of that have been in a moment. But we also wanted to touch on a few trends on the transition from reactive maintenance to predictive maintenance, and the cost distribution on a reactive type of approach to operations and maintenance sees a cost distribution where the administrative costs, the spares inventory, and the personnel are kind of the largest chunks of this cost distribution. The switch to a predictive maintenance, inclusive of a digital service or leveraging data, usually results in a reduction. Certainly the insurance, unfortunately, doesn't really change that much. But you can get some reduction in personnel cost, equipment cost, spares, and some administrative and overhead cost. Unfortunately, that in the current market scenario, that cost is largely gobbled up by the cost of the digital service. So you don't necessarily see a tremendous overall cost reduction when you factor in the cost of the digital service. However, there is room for improvement. And again, as we'll talk about in a moment, the COVID-19 impact on this is having a pronounced, having a more pronounced impact. So if we look at the top 6 trends that we've identified in kind of the COVID-19 era, if you will, when you look at an asset owner self-perform versus an OEM long-term service contract, the 3 key areas that we noted before that were the most expensive in the operations and maintenance budget are the personnel costs, the administrative costs, and the spares inventory. Based on the data that we've gathered so far in the past 6 months or so, the indication from asset owners that are self-performing their own maintenance is that they're looking to cut budgets somewhere between 20 to 30% across the board. That may be tough to achieve, but the way in which they're looking to do that is by cutting back on the performance of certain services. And again, we'll talk about that in a moment. For OEM service and warranty contracts, it's an interesting trend because even though they're a little bit more expensive than your typical asset owner self-perform, there is actually more margin for an ability to do cost reduction on the OEM side of things. And the reason we believe that is because OEMs will potentially have easier access to spare parts. They could more easily reduce the administrative cost by cutting some of the overhead. For instance, closing regional offices for service and maintenance and centralizing things a bit more, as well as on personnel costs. By leveraging the data that they have, they can more intelligently utilize traveling field technicians to go out and perform the service and maintenance according to a predictive and prescriptive maintenance schedule. That said, the OEMs are in a bit of a bind because they're getting so squeezed on their margins for turbine capex that they're often trying to sign lucrative long-term service contracts in the hope of making back some of the margin that they're having to give up on a turbine sale. So again, as we've identified here, there's potential for OEMs to reduce the cost, but they're not necessarily taking full advantage of it because it's a cost recovery mechanism for them. Trend number two in that same vein is the fact that some asset owners who are on a long-term service contract with an OEM are looking at ways they can reduce cost. And one way that they're evaluating this situation right now is to try and renegotiate their existing long-term service contract or potentially seek early termination to get onto an asset self-perform. So from that standpoint, it's certainly one way to reduce cost. The trade-off is that what we've seen, and we've certainly also gotten feedback from some of the insurance underwriters, that some of the small to medium-sized independent power producers that do a self-perform or potentially have an independent service provider tend to underperform on their asset performance when it comes to a comparison, a benchmark with the OEM performed maintenance. So that needs to be factored in. Number three, the production shutdowns over the past 5 to 6 months haven't necessarily resulted in a massive amount of panic buying, unlike toilet paper and other necessities that the rest of us seem to have shortages of. There hasn't been massive stockpiling or panic buying of spare parts, thankfully, but the mid to long-term impact of some of the production shutdowns may be that there is indeed reduced capacity for producing spares. So this is something that we're noting at this point, but we're not particularly concerned with in terms of a huge impact, but it is something that asset owners and independent service providers certainly need to be aware of. Trend number four is that in some case, social distancing measures and lockdowns have resulted in limited access to project sites, which has resulted in some asset owners trying to take a deferral on some of the non-critical maintenance. So standard maintenance procedures, as well as minor corrective repairs that won't necessarily impact the asset performance are being kind of put off, or were being put off certainly until some of the social distancing measures were relaxed and some of the lockdowns were lifted. And so long as it doesn't adversely impact the power purchase agreement obligations, I think asset owners are probably well within their right to be able to control cost by doing some of that deferred maintenance. That said, as we look at trend number 5, there has been, as a result of some of the lockdowns and deferred maintenance, there has been an uptick in interest around some of the digital services. And even though I mentioned before that some asset owners don't necessarily see the full potential return on investment yet, now is absolutely the time, if you're a digital service provider, to look at how your service can help an asset owner who is trying to remotely monitor and remotely understand the impact of their asset performance. Now is absolutely the time to get out there and share your story. And with that in mind, trend number 6 is also looking at the opportunity for asset owners to basically generate additional revenue from the the pile of data that either they have, maybe the SCADA and CMS companies have, or the OEMs have. But now is a time, with budget cutbacks being made on operations and maintenance, on the operations and maintenance side of things, now is the time to really look at how your asset performance or operational data could be monetized. And certainly, as we look at the market just in the United States, for instance, this graphic represents kind of the ceiling of what we think would be possible for either the asset owners on the left-hand side and the center, as well as the OEMs on the right-hand side, would be able to capture in terms of data monetization income. Again, we don't necessarily anticipate that all companies will fully monetize the full value of the entire spectrum of data that they have, but if they chose to, this represents the potential ceiling for them to capture that. So with that, thank you, everybody. That represents the overview of the global wind energy operations and maintenance market, including the top 6 trends that have resulted from the COVID-19 pandemic. If there are any further questions, please get in touch with us through our website, or you can reach out to me personally. And we will also have a full report coming out this week regarding the global wind energy operations and maintenance market. And with that, thank you, and I'll turn it back over to John.